The auction was already over by the time Mabel Hart arrived at Cutter's yard. She came down the hill the way she always did, slowly, because her knees had been giving her grief since September, and because the mud on the south path turned treacherous after rain. She carried a cloth bag over one arm and her coin purse in her fist, and she was breathing hard by the time she reached the fence line, though she'd never admit that to anyone standing nearby. There was plenty of people standing nearby. Old Gus Cutter's auction drew half the settlement whenever he had livestock to sell. It was entertainment as much as commerce. Men leaned on posts and passed tobacco back and forth, and women stood in clusters near the water trough and talked about whose husband had paid too much for a mule that wasn't worth it. Mabel slipped in along the edge of the crowd, which wasn't easy to do when you were her size, but she'd had years of practice making herself quiet, even when her body announced her presence. The main auction had ended. The healthy birds, 12 fat hens and a rooster built like a small boulder, had gone to the Prentice family for $4.60, which Mabel calculated as she'd watched from the road above. She hadn't been fast enough for those. Her knees had cost her. What was left was something else entirely. Gus Cutter stood beside a wooden crate at the far end of the yard, and inside that crate, 11 chickens huddled like they had already made peace with dying. They were Rhode Island Reds, or had been once. Now they were a sorry collection of dull feathers and hollow eyes and legs that trembled when they tried to stand. One had a comb that had gone nearly white. Two others had stopped standing altogether and simply sat in the straw with their necks stretched low. "Half a cent apiece," Gus announced to no one in particular. "Take 'em all for 5 cents, and I'll throw in the crate." Nobody moved. Mabel worked through the crowd. "Excuse me, pardon me, sorry," until she reached the crate and crouched down as best she could, which required a careful negotiation with gravity and her own center of weight, but she managed it. She looked at the birds up close. Their eyes were dull, yes. Their feathers were rough and patchy. But the nearest one, a bird with half its tail feathers missing, turned its head and looked back at her with something that wasn't quite gone yet. She reached 2 fingers through the slat, and it didn't flinch away. 5 cents, she said, standing back up. "And I'll take them." Gus looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. "Miss Hart." 5 cents for the lot, she said again. "You said." "I meant as a joke," he said. "Those birds are done for. Any man with sense can see it." "Good thing I'm not a man," she said. She counted out 5 cents from her purse and held it out. Gus looked at the coins, looked at her, looked at the crowd gathering around them with the specific energy of people who sense something amusing is about to happen. He took the money. Someone behind her laughed first. A short, sharp sound, like a branch snapping. Then more of them joined in the way it always happens, one voice giving the others permission. Mabel heard it. She heard every word of it, too. Fool's money. Dead birds for a dead farm. Old Earl Hart's daughter throwing good sense after bad. Someone said something she didn't catch the whole of but caught enough of. A joke about her size and the size of the crate and whether the chickens would be better off eaten now than later. She picked up the crate. It was heavy and awkward, and she had to hold it against her side with both arms wrapped around the bottom, and it threw off her balance on the muddy path, and she slipped once and caught herself and kept walking. She did not look back at them. Her family's homestead sat at the north end of Briar Ridge, which was a generous name for what was more accurately described as a struggling collection of farms scratched out of hard prairie soil and held together mostly by stubbornness. Her father, Earl Hart, had broken that ground 20 years before with his wife Margaret, who had died of fever when Mabel was 9. Her brother Cal had gone east 3 years back and written twice since then. That left Mabel and her father and 42 acres of land that produced less each year as Earl's back got worse and his hands got shakier. The farm had a chicken coop, but it was empty. They'd sold the last of their laying hens in October to cover the cost of flour and lamp oil. What they had now was a garden plot, 6 rows of winter-tough turnips, a milk cow named Henrietta, who was getting old, and the dried goods stored in the root cellar that Mabel calculated would last until late February, if they were careful. It was November. Earl was sitting on the porch step when she came up the road with the crate. He watched her approach without speaking for a long moment. "What's that you've got?" he said finally. "Chickens." "I can see they're chickens, Mabel. 11 of them, from Cutter's auction." He was quiet. He was a man who said things once and then waited to see what happened, which was both one of his best qualities and one of his most aggravating ones. He watched her set the crate down in the yard and peel back the slat she'd loosened to look inside. "How much?" he said. 12 cents. 12 for everything. I paid Gus 5, and I spent 7 on herbs from Mrs. Pryor's on the way back." 12 cents. "Yes. Mabel." He rubbed the side of his face. "That was all we had left from the feed sale." "I know that. Those birds look half dead." "I know that too." He looked at her for a long time. His eyes were the same gray as hers, which she'd always thought was funny, given how different they were in most other respects. He had her mother's patience in the good moments and her mother's stubbornness in the bad ones, and she had inherited both and couldn't always tell them apart. "Your mother," he said, "used to do things I didn't understand and turn out to be right about them." He stood up, bones creaking, and went inside. Mabel took that as the closest thing to permission she was going to get. She put them in the coop with fresh straw and a low lamp for warmth, and she did not let herself think about what would happen if all 11 were dead by morning. That kind of thinking was useful in small doses and poisonous in larger ones, and she had learned, somewhere around age 14, to measure it out carefully. She didn't sleep much. At 4 in the morning, she lit the lantern and went out and sat on the coop floor and watched them. 9 of them had made it through the night in some form of standing. 2 were still down. The one with the missing tail feathers, she'd started thinking of her as Stub, had moved closer to the lamp and was standing with her eyes half open in what Mabel chose to interpret as something other than dying. "All right," Mabel said quietly to all of them. "Let's figure out what's wrong with you." She knew something about sick chickens. Not formally. There was no formal knowledge to be had when you were a farmer's daughter in Briar Ridge. But she'd grown up watching her mother tend the flock, and her mother had been the kind of woman who observed things carefully and remembered what she observed. Mabel had inherited that too, even if nobody gave her credit for it. The first thing she noticed was the smell of their droppings. Not the ordinary smell, but something beneath it. Bitter, faintly medicinal. She'd seen that once before in a neighbor's birds, years ago, and her mother had said the words crop impaction under her breath and spent the next week squeezing birds gently and feeding them small amounts of olive oil. She didn't have olive oil. She had lard, which was not the same thing, and she had dried chamomile from Mrs. Pryor, which she'd bought on instinct because her mother had always kept it. And she had the understanding that doing something imperfect was better than doing nothing. She started with warm water and a pinch of chamomile, made into a weak tea she cooled until it was just above room temperature. She held each bird in her lap, all 11 of them, one at a time, and coaxed the liquid in with a spoon and sat with them until they swallowed. It took most of the morning. Then she went inside and made breakfast and did not tell her father what she'd spent the morning doing. On the third day, she saw Frances Holloway coming down the road toward the house, which was not a sight that ever meant good news. Frances was the wife of Henry Holloway, who ran the trading post, and she had the specific quality of a woman who delivered information in the tone of a favor even when the information was unkind. She was 45, thin as paper, and had never once in Mabel's memory said something that couldn't be improved by not saying it. Mabel was in the yard when Frances came to the gate and did not open it, which meant she wasn't planning to stay. "Heard you bought Cutter's dead birds," Frances said. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Word travels fast," Mabel said. "This is Briar Ridge, sweetheart." Frances rested her hands on the top fence rail. "Everything travels fast. People are saying you spent your last money on birds that won't last the week." "People are busy. They're worried about your father is all. He's not getting younger, and if the two of you end up without resources in January, we'll be fine." Frances tilted her head. "Those birds are going to die, Mabel. Everyone can see it. Even Gus felt bad taking your money." Mabel looked at her. She thought about several things she could say. She picked the shortest one. "Thank you for stopping by," she said. Frances waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. She left. Mabel went back to the coop. 6 of the 11 were standing on day 4. 7 on day 5. The 2 that had been completely down were still down, but one of them, a bird she'd started calling Low, for obvious reasons, had started lifting her head to drink on her own, which was something. The change, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It never is. It was just that the bird started moving differently. slightly more purposeful, slightly less like they were conserving energy for something final. Stubbs started pecking at the straw. The rooster, she hadn't named him anything because she wasn't sure yet whether he was going to make it, stood up on day 6 and crowed, though the sound that came out was thin and croaky, more like a complaint than a declaration. Earl heard it from the house. He came to the coop doorway and looked in at the birds and then at his daughter, who was sitting on an overturned bucket mending a tear in the shelter cloth she'd rigged across the north corner to cut the draft. "That rooster crowed," he said. "Did," she said. He stood there for a moment. "How many did you lose?" "One." She didn't look up from the mending. "The runt. She went night before last, quietly." He nodded. Then, "What are you feeding them?" "Warm mash in the morning, chamomile water between, cracked corn at night when they're settled, mixed with a little dried thyme from the garden. Thyme helps with the digestion. Mama used to say so." Earl was quiet. "I know it sounds like a lot of fuss," she said. "Your mother," he said, "used to say a sick creature is an honest one. It'll tell you what it needs if you bother to pay attention." He paused. "She also said most people don't bother." He left her to it. It was the longest conversation they'd had about anything in 3 weeks. The Saturday market at the center of Briar Ridge happened every week regardless of weather, which in November meant everyone showed up cold and moved fast and transacted business with the bare minimum of conversation. Mabel went for flour and the particular kind of hard corn that her mash recipe needed, and she pushed her handcart down the main road and tried to be invisible, which she had a complicated relationship with. She wasn't invisible. She never had been. She was a large woman in a town that had decided years ago what that meant about her, and the decision had been made so long ago that most people didn't even think about it consciously anymore. It was just the background fact of Mabel Hart. Big, soft, slow, sad. She had learned to move through that reality without letting it devour her, but it cost her something every time. At the flower stall, she overheard 2 men from the Decker farm talking about her, not trying to be quiet about it either. "Figure she's feeding those birds better than herself, way things are looking." Low laughter. "Be scrawny chickens to match her by the time she's done." More laughter. She bought her flour. She counted out the coins carefully, more carefully than necessary, as something to do with her hands. The man at the stall, young, maybe 20, not from the immediate settlement, looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Those your chickens they're talking about?" he said. "Suppose so. Rhode Island Reds that Cutter was selling off." "That's right." He tilted his head. "My uncle runs a flock of those, few counties east. Good birds when they're healthy. What went wrong with Cutter's?" She hadn't expected the question to be asked seriously. She considered him for a moment. "Crop impaction mostly," she said. "Some of them had secondary issues. Yeah, the feathers suggested mite damage on top of the main problem. I'm working through it." He nodded slowly. "Chamomile water? And thyme. And keeping them warm, which sounds simple, but the draft in Cutter's coop was bad." "What are you planning to do with them, once they're right?" "Eat and lay," she said. "That's what chickens do." He smiled. "Not the mean kind, just an ordinary one." "Good luck with them." She took her flour and her handcart and went home, and she thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. It was a small thing, a stranger asking a real question and listening to the answer, but it sat with her in a way that the laughter from the Decker men didn't, which told her something about the mathematics of how small decencies and small cruelties are not equal in weight even when they're similar in size. By the end of November, she had 9 birds standing and eating and moving with something approaching normal chicken behavior. The 2 that were still struggling she kept separate, warmer, with smaller and more frequent feedings. The rooster, she had finally named him Anchor because he seemed to be the one the hens oriented toward when they were unsettled, had developed a proper crow and was using it aggressively every morning at a time that suggested he had no interest in anyone else's sleep schedule. Earl started getting up to hear it. He didn't say anything about this. He just started appearing in the kitchen earlier, making coffee, and sometimes Mabel would look out the coop window and see him standing on the porch with his cup, listening. She started keeping notes, not formal records. She didn't have the paper for that, but a corner of the flour sack's brown wrapping that she smoothed and kept inside the coop, and she made small marks on it with a charcoal stick. Date, feeding amounts, observations. which birds were improving fastest and what she'd done differently with them. What the droppings told her. What the feathers told her. Her mother had kept notes, too, in a journal that Mabel still had somewhere in the house, its spine cracked and its pages soft from handling. She hadn't looked at it in years because looking at it made her chest do things she didn't have time for. But she found herself thinking about it now, thinking about what her mother had written in it and what she herself was learning that her mother might not have known, and whether the two things together added up to something. On the last day of November, Stubb laid an egg. It was small, smaller than a good laying egg should be, and the shell was pale and a little rough at one end, but it was an egg, and Mabel held it in both hands for a long moment before she did anything else. Then she went inside and scrambled it for her father's breakfast. He ate it without knowing what it was. He said, "That's a good egg," and went back to his coffee. Mabel sat across from him with her own cup and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not pride exactly, not happiness exactly, but something that included both and was also different from both. Something that had to do with the particular satisfaction of a thing working the way you believed it could, when everyone else was certain it couldn't. She thought about Frances Holloway's smile. She thought about the Decker men at the market. She finished her coffee. Then she went back to the coop because there was still work to do. December came in hard, not the kind of hard that announces itself gradually, giving people time to prepare and adjust and move their lives indoors piece by piece. The kind that arrives overnight without apology. A north wind that dropped the temperature 20 degrees between supper and sunrise, and a frost that killed the last of the garden turnips before Mabel could get to them with a cloth cover. She found them in the morning, black-edged and soft, and she stood in the garden for a moment looking at them without moving. Then she pulled them up anyway, because even ruined turnips could be boiled into something, and she had stopped being precious about food sometime around age 12. The chickens had made it through the cold snap, which she counted as the first real test. She'd banked straw along the coop's north wall the week before on instinct. The wind always came from the north, and the coop's boards were old enough to breathe in ways they weren't supposed to, and the lamp had stayed lit. Anchor crowed at his usual hour. Stubb was laying every other day now, small eggs still, but consistent. 3 others had started laying too, irregular and tentative, like they weren't quite sure yet if the arrangement was permanent. 9 healthy birds. That was what she had. The 10th was still fragile, a hen she'd named Quarter because she'd been the last quarter of the sick flock to start improving, and the 11th had been the one she'd lost in November. 9 birds, 1 rooster, and a coop that needed new boards on the east side before February made the gap worse. She told her father about the turnips over breakfast. He took it the way he took most bad news, which was to sit with it quietly for a minute and then ask what came next. "I can pull some boards from the old storage shed," he said. "Fix the coop wall." "Your back?" "My back is my business," he said. "I can pull boards." She didn't argue. She had learned that arguing with her father about what he could and couldn't do was a transaction with diminishing returns. He would do it anyway, and he would do it slower and more carefully than he used to, and his face would be tight with the effort, and neither of them would mention it. The boards got pulled, the gap got patched. It wasn't pretty work. The new boards didn't match the old ones in thickness, and the seams let in light, but it held the wind, which was the only thing that mattered. The problem, entering December in earnest, was feed. Mabel had calculated this in October when she'd first bought the birds, but the calculation had been optimistic in the way that calculations made, when you're trying to justify a decision, always tend to be. She'd assumed the birds would eat less than healthy birds because they were sick, which was true in November. She hadn't fully accounted for the fact that recovering birds eat more than sick ones, because recovery costs energy, and she hadn't accounted for the speed of the recovery, which was faster than she'd dared hope. She had enough cracked corn to last 6 weeks if she was careful. She had the thyme from the garden, dried. She had chamomile she'd traded a jar of preserved plum for with Mrs. Pryor. She had lard and oats and a supply of dried meal that she was also trying to stretch for the household. She started supplementing the feed with things that cost nothing. Kitchen scraps, vegetable peelings, the outside leaves of cabbages, eggshells crumbled fine for calcium. She dug into the frozen ground near the creek bank on the warmer afternoons and found grubs and turned them into the mash, which the chickens accepted with a specific enthusiasm the chickens reserve for finding something alive to eat. She gathered dried grass seed from the field edges which took an hour of cold hands and produced modest amounts. But modest amounts added up. She boiled bones from the winter's first slaughtered rabbit. Earl shot rabbits when he could manage the wok, which was less often now, and let the broth cool and mixed it into the warm mash. She had no idea if this helped or not. It felt like it should. The bird seemed to go at the warm mash with more energy on the days she used it, though she was honest enough with herself to know that she might be seeing what she wanted to see. The notes on the flour sack paper were getting crowded. She started writing smaller. She did not go to the Saturday market in the second week of December. They didn't have money for it, and she didn't have anything to sell yet, and going to the market without either was a specific kind of humiliation that she'd had enough of. But she heard about the market anyway, the way you hear about things in a small settlement, through the particular gossip ecology that moves information faster than a telegraph and with considerably less accuracy. Frances Holloway came by again. This time she opened the gate. "I brought something," she said, holding out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Cornbread. We made extra." Mabel looked at the bundle, then at Frances. Frances had the expression of someone doing something they'd rehearsed and were now uncertain about. "Thank you," Mabel said, and took it. "How are the birds doing?" Frances asked. She was looking past Mabel toward the coop with what might have been genuine curiosity or might have been the need to confirm her expectations. "Better." "Better meaning alive?" "Better meaning laying," Mabel said. "4 of them now." Frances blinked. That was clearly not what she'd expected to hear. That's something." "It is," Mabel agreed. There was a pause. Frances shifted her weight. "People have been saying—" She stopped, started again. "Henry heard from Gus Cutter that you've been going out to the creek in the cold digging for grubs." "Gus Cutter," Mabel said, "should find something better to do with his time." "He's not wrong, is he? That you're doing it?" "I'm doing it," Mabel said. "It's good supplemental protein for recovery stage birds. Costs nothing." Frances looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once, some of them unkind, some of them uncertain. "Mabel," she said, "you know people worry." "People find my business interesting," Mabel said. "That's not the same as worrying about me." Frances didn't have an answer to that, which Mabel thought was probably the most honest thing about the whole exchange. She thanked her again for the cornbread and waited at the gate until Frances left, and then she went back inside and put the cornbread on the table and sat down and felt the particular exhaustion of being watched. Not the physical kind of tired, which she could manage. The other kind. She cut a piece of the cornbread and ate it. It was good. Frances Holloway was a mean-spirited gossip, but she made decent cornbread, and Mabel wasn't too proud to appreciate both of those things simultaneously. Quote, Christmas in the Hart household was quiet, in the way that poverty makes things quiet. There was no tree. They hadn't had the tradition even when things were better, because her father wasn't sentimental about it. But her mother had always made a particular kind of molasses cookie at Christmas, and Mabel made them now, having the recipe to stretch the molasses. Earl sat at the table and watched her work without saying much. "Smells like your mother's kitchen," he said finally. "Same recipe. I know it's the same recipe." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Smells like her anyway." She didn't say anything. She cut the cookies into rough circles and put them in the oven, and the smell filled the house, and she thought about her mother with the specific precision that grief acquires over time. Not a wave, but a particular clear image, her mother's hands on the rolling pin, the way she'd hum without seeming to know she was doing it. "She would have liked those birds," Earl said. "She would have named all of them something impractical," Mabel said. "She would have." He almost smiled. "She named the cow Clara after her own mother and then cried when we sold her." "I named the rooster Anchor." "I know. I heard you talking to him." Mabel glanced over at him. "I wasn't—" "You were," he said. "You talk to them when you don't think I can hear you. You always did talk to animals. Your mother did too." He paused. "It's not a criticism." She pulled the cookies from the oven. They were a little dark on the bottom, which was her fault for not watching the heat, and slightly too thick because she'd been distracted. But they were cookies, and they were warm, and they ate them at the kitchen table and didn't talk about money or winter or what February was going to look like. January broke her twice. The first time was the cold. A stretch of 10 days where the temperature dropped low enough that breath turned to ice on the scarf before it finished leaving her mouth, and she had to fill the lamp with the last of the good oil and keep it burning day and night in the coop. And she spent those 10 nights waking every 2 hours to go check that it hadn't gone out. She was running on 4 and 5 hours of sleep, which is the kind of sleep debt that accumulates invisibly, until one morning you find yourself standing in the middle of the coop with a bucket of mash, forgetting what you came in to do. Quarter stopped eating on the 5th day of the cold snap. Mabel hand-fed her, sitting cross-legged in the straw, with the bird in her lap, working the warm mash in with a spoon one small amount at a time, the way you'd feed something much younger and more fragile. It took 40 minutes. She did it twice a day for 3 days. Quarter started eating on her own again on day 4. The second break was a person. His name was Robert Stills, and he was 27, and he farmed 110 acres south of the ridge with his older brother. He was tall and had the kind of face that looked better outdoors than in, and he had been, for a brief and painful period 2 years ago, the subject of Mabel's most private hopes. She was not particularly proud of this. She was less proud of the conversation she overheard in January. She hadn't meant to overhear it. She was at the edge of the Holloway trading post, waiting for Henry to finish with another customer before she could ask about trading 24 eggs. She had enough now to trade, for a spool of mending thread. Robert Stills and another man, one of the Vance brothers, were on the other side of the store's corner post, talking in the relaxed voices of men who are not watching whether anyone can hear them. Heard her birds are actually laying now. Hearts girl? I heard that too. Probably just talk. Gus says he saw some through the fence. Says they look all right. Huh. A pause. Can't picture it honestly. Fat as she is, you'd think she'd just eat them. Laughter. Low and comfortable. The kind that happens between men who've known each other long enough not to bother being kind in each other's company. Mabel stood at the corner of the trading post for 3 full seconds. She counted them. Then she went inside, traded the eggs for the thread, and walked home. She walked the long way. The long way took her past the creek and through the field edge, and no one used it in January, and she walked it slowly, feeling the cold through her coat, and she let herself feel the thing in her chest that she usually kept under control. She named it to herself the way she named the chickens, directly, without fuss. It was humiliation, and it was hurt, and it was rage, and it was grief for the particular specific future she'd once imagined that Robert Stills had unknowingly been part of. And none of those things were comfortable, and all of them were hers. She stood at the creek for 5 minutes. The ice had formed along the edges, but the center still moved, slow and dark under the winter light. Then she walked home. She went to the coop, and she sat with Stubb in her lap, and she scratched the back of the bird's neck the way Stubb liked, and Stubb made a low sound and settled against her. And Mabel sat in the straw and breathed until the thing in her chest went back to its usual manageable size. She could not afford to carry that weight and do this work at the same time. That was the practical truth of it. And practical truth was something she'd always been better at than most people gave her credit for. The laying had become, by mid-January, a rhythm she could count on. 8 birds now. Quarter had joined the rotation, tentative and inconsistent, but present. The eggs were improving, not just in frequency, but in quality. The shells firmer, the yolks a deeper color than she'd expected, almost orange in the winter light, which she'd read about somewhere and connected to the variety of the supplemental feed. The grubs. The mixed greens she dried in autumn and crumbled in now. The bone broth mash. She kept refining it. Not because she had a plan yet, the plan came later, but because refinement was what she did. It was what she'd always done with any system she took charge of, the way some people can't see a crooked frame on a wall without straightening it. She adjusted the chamomile ratio. She found that the birds did better in the morning if she let them out briefly into the yard, even on cold days, 10 or 15 minutes of movement, and then brought them back in. She separated the stronger layers from Quarter and the 2 others who were still not quite at full strength, not to segregate them, but to make sure the stronger ones weren't eating the weaker ones' portions. She was talking to herself more, or to the birds. There was not always a clear distinction. "You're getting bossy," she told Anchor one morning when he'd gotten between her and the feed bucket, and refused to move until she acknowledged his presence. "You know what happens to roosters who get too full of themselves?" Anchor stared at her with the specific blank authority of a rooster who does not believe any consequences apply to him. "I'm serious," she said. He stepped aside, slightly, more like a lateral adjustment than a concession. She filled the feeder and watched them eat and made notes on the flour sack paper, which was nearly full now. She was going to need a new piece. The second Saturday of February, Mabel went to the market with 3 dozen eggs packed in straw in a flat-bottom basket, and she set up at the edge of the square where the smaller vendors went, and she waited. People walked past. Most of them glanced at her and kept walking, which was fine. 2 women stopped to look at the eggs and then at each other in the way people look at something they weren't expecting. "These are your birds?" one of them said. Her name was Dorothea Marsh, and she was 30 or so, with 3 children and a husband who farmed competently without particular distinction. "The ones from Cutter's auction?" "That's right," Mabel said. Dorothea picked up an egg and looked at it. The shell was smooth, a deep reddish brown that Rhode Island Reds produce when they're at full health. "They look like good eggs." "They are good eggs." The other woman, younger, one of the Finch girls, newly married, said, "I heard she fed them bone broth," in a tone that suggested this was either impressive or absurd, and she hadn't decided which. "And other things," Mabel said. "The diet matters. What they eat changes what the egg is." Dorothea was still examining the egg with a focus that suggested she was seriously considering it. "How much?" 2 cents for 6. "That's the same as Prentice's price." "Prentice's hens are good hens," Mabel said. "You can buy from him, or you can crack one of mine open when you get home and compare the yolk color. I'll be here next week too." Dorothea looked at her, a small, evaluating look, then she said, 6 eggs, and counted out the coins. The Finch girl bought 6 too, in the end, mostly out of curiosity, which was fine. Curiosity spent the same as conviction. She sold 22 eggs before noon. She could have sold the rest, but she held them back because she'd started thinking about something. A calculation she'd been running in her head since January that was becoming less hypothetical and more concrete. She needed those eggs for the next stage of what she was building. She walked home with more money than she'd had in 2 months, and the particular feeling of a thing starting to turn. Not arrived yet, not secure, but turning. Earl was on the porch when she got back, which he usually was in the afternoons when his back wasn't too bad. He watched her come up the road. "How'd you do?" he said. She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, 22 eggs. 22. He looked out at the yard. At the coop, which they could both hear from where they stood, the low murmur of 9 birds going about their afternoon. "Your mother," he said, "would have charged 3 cents for 6. Mabel looked at him. "Next week," she said, "I'm charging 3 cents for 6. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was near enough. She went inside and put the money in the tin on the kitchen shelf and stood at the window and looked at the coop and felt again that wordless particular thing. Not pride, not happiness. Something that required more room than either of those words could hold. The work wasn't done. It was barely started, if she was honest about what she was beginning to understand she was doing. But for right now, this afternoon, with the money in the tin and the birds making their sounds in the coop and her father on the porch drinking his coffee, she let herself stand at the window for a few minutes and not think about what came next. She owed herself that much. The idea came to her in March, on a Tuesday, while she was cleaning eggs. It wasn't a sudden thing. It had been building in pieces for weeks. A thought here, a calculation there, something she'd overheard at the market that she'd turned over in her mind on the walk home without quite knowing why. But on that Tuesday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a damp cloth and a basket of 31 eggs that were the cleanest, most consistent eggs she'd ever produced, the pieces came together all at once, and she sat very still for a moment and thought, this could work. This could actually work, or it could ruin everything. She finished cleaning the eggs before she let herself think about it further. That was a discipline she'd developed. Finish the task in front of you before you go chasing the next one. Her mother had called it keeping your feet under you, which was advice that made more sense to Mabel now than it had when she was 12. The thing she'd overheard at the market 3 weeks prior was this. Agnes Whitmore was coming to Briar Ridge in April. Agnes Whitmore was not famous in the way that politicians or generals were famous. She was famous in the particular way that a certain kind of practical woman becomes famous on the frontier, known across 4 counties as someone whose judgment about livestock, crops, and agricultural methods was worth more than most men's formal opinions. She ran a farm of 200 acres east of Caldwell with her widowed sister, and she had twice testified before the Territorial Land Committee on matters of grazing rights. And she had, this was the part that had lodged in Mabel's brain like a splinter, organized and judged 3 regional poultry competitions in the past 6 years. She was, by any measure, a person whose assessment of Mabel's birds would carry weight that Briar Ridge gossip could not easily dismiss. Agnes was coming to visit her cousin, Marjorie Pruitt, who lived half a mile from the Hart farm. She would be in the settlement for 4 days in the second week of April. Mabel had been thinking about those 4 days for 3 weeks. She put the eggs in the basket and went to find her father. Earl was in the barn, which he'd taken to spending mornings in lately, doing small repairs that he'd let accumulate over the winter. His hands were still good even when his back wasn't, and he could sit on a low stool and work on harness leather or tool handles for hours. She found him with a draw knife and a broken rake handle, shaping a new grip. "I want to ask Agnes Whitmore to taste my birds," Mabel said. Earl kept working for a moment. "Agnes Whitmore. She's coming in April, staying with Marjorie Pruitt. I know who she is and where she's staying." He set the draw knife down and looked at her. "You want to slaughter your flock for a tasting. Not the whole flock. 2 birds. The 2 I've been putting the most work into. I'd keep the rest for laying. But 2 birds, prepared the right way, serve to Agnes Whitmore and whoever she wants to bring." Mabel crossed her arms. "If she says they're worth something, people will believe it. She's not from here. She has no reason to be kind to me or cruel to me. She'll just tell the truth about what she tastes." Earl was quiet for a long time. The barn smelled of old wood and leather and the faint must of winter that hadn't quite aired out yet. "And if she says they're nothing special," he said, "then I'll know that too. You'll know it in front of everyone." "I'll know it in front of everyone," Mabel agreed. "I can live with that." "Can you?" She looked at him. "I've been living with worse for 23 years, Papa." He picked up the draw knife again, worked the handle for a moment. Then, "You'd need to fatten 2 birds specifically. Change their feed. What are you thinking?" "Corn-heavy mash in the last 3 weeks. Better grain than what I've been using. I'd need to spend some of the egg money on it. And I'd keep them separated from the flock so there's no competition for the feed. I want them calm and well-fed and not running around burning off weight they need to be carrying." He was nodding slightly, the way he nodded when he was actually listening and not just waiting for someone to finish talking. "You know how to cook them?" "No," she said. "Not the way I mean. I know how to roast a chicken. I don't know how to cook one the way that makes people remember it. That's the part I have to figure out." Earl was quiet again. Then he said, "Your mother used to salt them overnight, before she cooked. Said it changed the meat." Mabel looked at him. "You never told me that. You never asked me about cooking chickens before." She left him to the rake handle and went back to the house and sat at the table with a piece of paper, a real piece this time, half a sheet she'd been saving, and started writing down what she knew and what she needed to learn. What? The problem with asking Agnes Whitmore for a tasting was that you had to actually ask Agnes Whitmore for a tasting, which meant going to Marjorie Pruitt's house and making the request in person, and risking the specific brand of polite refusal that would be worse in some ways than outright rejection. Mabel waited until the second day of Agnes's visit. The first day, she reasoned, Agnes would be tired from travel and preoccupied with the business of arriving. The second day, she would be settled enough to think clearly. She put on her best dress, which was dark blue wool and fit her well enough if she didn't think too hard about how it had fit 3 years ago. She pinned her hair properly. She put 6 of her best eggs in a cloth-lined box and carried them to Marjorie Pruitt's house at 9 in the morning, which was early enough to catch people before their day organized itself into obligations. Marjorie answered the door with the expression of someone who was not expecting company and was deciding whether to pretend she was. "Mabel Hart," she said. "Good morning, Mrs. Pruitt. I apologize for coming without sending word first. I was hoping to speak with your cousin if she has a few minutes." "Agnes is—" Marjorie stopped. "What's this about?" "My chickens," Mabel said. "I'd like to ask her something about them." Marjorie looked at the box of eggs, looked at Mabel. Mabel waited. She was good at waiting. She had spent most of her life waiting for people to decide what to do with her. "Come in," Marjorie said, not warmly, but she said it. Agnes Whitmore was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a letter she'd been reading. She was 60 or so, with gray hair pulled back with brisk practicality and hands that looked like they had done decades of real work. She looked up when Mabel came in, and her expression was the neutral expression of someone who doesn't know yet what they're looking at. "This is Mabel Hart," Marjorie said. "Earl Hart's daughter. She farms north of the ridge." "Miss Hart." Agnes nodded. Not unwelcoming, just measured. "I'm sorry to intrude," Mabel said. "I brought these." She put the box on the table and opened it. "My laying hens. Rhode Island Reds. I bought them sick last November and spent the winter getting them right." Agnes looked at the eggs. She picked one up with the attention of someone who has held a lot of eggs and knows what she's looking at. She turned it in her fingers, looked at the shell color, the shape, the weight. "These are good eggs," she said. The assessment was flat and factual, which was more credible than enthusiasm would have been. "I know," Mabel said. "What I'd like to ask—" She stopped, steadied herself. This was the part she'd rehearsed, and it still felt precarious to say out loud. "I've been developing a method for the feed and the care, for the whole cycle, how they eat, how they're kept, how they recover from illness. The eggs are one result, but I think the meat is the more interesting result. And I'd like to ask you to taste 2 of my birds before you leave Briar Ridge, prepared by me, at your convenience." Agnes looked at her for a moment, a real look, the kind that's actually taking something in. "You want my assessment," Agnes said. "I want your honest one. You don't know me. You have no reason to spare my feelings, and I'm not asking you to." A small silence. Marjorie in the background made some kind of movement that Mabel didn't look at. "Why does my assessment matter?" Agnes said. "What are you hoping to do with it?" "I don't know exactly yet," Mabel said, which was mostly true. "But I know that what I've built is worth something, and I know that my opinion of my own work doesn't count for much in this town. Yours might." Agnes considered this. She put the egg back in the box. She drank some of her tea. She was not a woman who performed decisiveness. She was simply, actually, deciding. And it took a minute. "Thursday," she said. "I leave Friday morning. Thursday afternoon I can come for an hour." "Thank you," Mabel said. "Don't thank me yet. I'll say what I think, which is what you asked for." "That's what I want," Mabel said. Bosk. She had 8 days. 8 days to fatten 2 birds, develop a preparation method she'd never used before, and keep herself from catastrophizing every hour of every day. The last of those was the hardest. She separated 2 hens from the flock. Not Stubb, who was her best layer and too valuable to the egg operation, and not Quarter, who was still inconsistent. She chose 2 mid-weight birds who had come the furthest in terms of recovery, birds she'd been watching for signs of the thing she'd been trying to build into the flock. Calm temperament, steady eating, good feather coverage, the specific quality of a well-cared-for animal that shows in how it moves through the world. She put them in a smaller enclosure near the house where she could monitor them closely, and she switched their feed to the corn-heavy mash she'd planned, with cracked wheat and a small amount of dried herbs, thyme, and sage, which her mother's journal mentioned in the context of poultry without explaining why. She would learn why. She intended to learn why. But for now she used them because her mother had, and her mother had been right about most things. She let herself into the cellar and found the jar of sea salt she'd been keeping for special occasions and measured it in her palm and thought about what her father had said. Salted overnight. She had no precedent for this beyond his word, which was enough. She needed to do a test before Thursday. On the Friday before, she asked her father to come to the table for supper without telling him why it was different. She cooked the smallest bird she had, a spare cockerel that hadn't been part of her main flock, a young bird she'd traded for in February, using everything she'd worked out. The overnight salt cure, the thyme and sage stuffed into the cavity, roasted slow in the iron pot with the lid on for the first hour and off for the second. She basted it with the pan drippings twice. She'd never done it exactly this way before. Her hands weren't entirely sure of themselves. She put it on the table and sat down and watched her father serve himself and take a bite. He chewed. He looked at the table. He chewed some more. "Mabel," he said, "I know it might need... It doesn't need anything." She looked at him. He wasn't a man who said things for effect. He took another bite and sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with things that required fair consideration. "That's different," he said. "I don't know how to tell you different from what, exactly, but it's a different thing than I've eaten before." She cut a piece for herself. The meat was, she searched for the right word and settled on dense, which wasn't quite it, but it was in the direction of the right word. It had weight to it. The flavor was in the meat itself, not just on the surface, and the texture held without being tough. The thyme was present, but not loud. It wasn't perfect. The skin on the wing had dried slightly. She'd needed more moisture under the lid, or a lower temperature in the second hour. But the bones were right, and the bones were where the flavor came from, and the bones told her that the method was sound even if the execution needed refinement. She made a note. She refined it. The days between Friday and Thursday were not peaceful days. Word had gotten out, because word always gets out in Briar Ridge, and this time she suspected Marjorie Pruitt was the source, that Agnes Whitmore was going to taste Mabel Hart's chickens before she left. The market on Saturday had a particular electric quality that Mabel recognized as the town preparing itself to witness something, which it had decided was probably going to be embarrassing. She went to the market because she had eggs to sell, and she needed the money, and not going would have been a concession she wasn't willing to make. She set up her spot at the edge of the square, and she sold her eggs at 3 cents for 6 the way she'd told her father she would. And she did not look for Robert Stills in the crowd, and if she saw him, she didn't register it. Dorothea Marsh came back. This time she brought her sister. "We've been using your eggs for a month," Dorothea said. "My husband noticed. He thought I'd changed something in the cooking." "It's the yolks," Mabel said. "The color. The fat content is different when the diet is different. Can you always get that color?" "So far," Mabel said. "I can't promise always. I can promise I'm working toward it." Dorothea's sister, a woman named Ruth, who was taller and quieter, said, "Are you actually putting Agnes Whitmore's tasting together? I heard you were." "Thursday," Mabel said. Ruth looked at her with a kind of frank curiosity that was different from the usual quality of people's attention. "I'm not trying to be unkind when I say this. Do you know what you're doing? Agnes isn't polite about things that don't deserve politeness." "I know," Mabel said. "That's why I asked her." Ruth bought a dozen eggs. That was twice her usual amount. Mabel didn't read too much into it, but she filed it away. At home that evening, she sat in the coop for an hour, in the near dark with the lantern turned low, listening to the birds settle themselves for the night. Anchor was on his roosting bar, which he treated as a throne. Stubb was pressed against the corner she preferred, which was the same corner every night without variation. The 2 birds she'd separated for Thursday's tasting were in their enclosure, quiet, well-fed. She thought about what losing this would look like. She made herself think about it clearly, the way you have to look at a wound to treat it properly. If Agnes Whitmore came on Thursday and tasted the birds and found them ordinary, or found the preparation clumsy, or simply shrugged in the polite, diplomatic way that accomplished people shrug when they don't want to say something isn't worth the trouble. That was the risk. The town would hear about it within a day. Frances Holloway would appear at the gate before the week was out. The eggs would keep selling, probably, but the larger thing she'd been building in her own mind, the thing that didn't have a name yet but was starting to take shape, that would be harder to hold on to. She could hold on to it. She knew herself well enough to know that. But harder was harder, and she was already tired in ways she didn't talk about. Stubb shifted in her corner and made the low sound she made when she was fully comfortable in going to sleep. Mabel turned the lantern up slightly, took out the notes she'd been keeping, and read through them from the beginning. November, the 12 cents. December, and the frost. January, and the cold snap, and quarters 3 days of hand-feeding and the thing she'd heard Robert Stills say on the other side of the trading post wall. February, and the first market eggs, and her father's almost smile. All of it had been real. The work had been real. Whatever happened Thursday, the work had been real, and it was hers, and no one could take the record of it. She put the notes away and went inside. Assam. Thursday came the way important days always come. Too ordinary in the morning and too significant by afternoon. She was up at 4, which was not unusual, but she was useless for the first hour in the way that anxiety makes a person useless, standing in the kitchen with coffee going cold in her hands and thinking about 17 things at once. She made herself eat breakfast. She went to the coop and did the morning routine exactly as always because routine was an anchor and she needed one. She brought the 2 tasting birds in at mid-morning and dispatched them quickly and cleanly, the way her father had taught her, without fuss. She'd done it enough times that her hands didn't hesitate, which she was grateful for. Then she started the process. The brine she'd mixed the night before, the birds going in for their final rest, the herbs she'd dried herself laid out on the table, the iron pot cleaned and ready. Agnes Whitmore arrived at 2 o'clock with Marjorie Pruitt, an unexpected and slightly alarming 3 other women Mabel didn't know. Visitors from Agnes's county, it turned out. Women who had arrived the day before for reasons unrelated to Mabel, but who Agnes had apparently invited along. 5 people instead of 2. 5 opinions instead of 2. Mabel felt this land in her chest, and then she let it go because there was nothing to be done about it now except cook. "Your kitchen is small," Marjorie observed, looking around. "It does what I need," Mabel said. She pulled the chairs from the table and the 2 from the corner. "Please sit. It'll be about 40 minutes yet." Agnes sat at the head of the table as naturally as a woman who is accustomed to being at the head of tables. She looked around the kitchen with the same evaluating attention she'd given the eggs, the notes on the wall where Mabel had started tacking them, the herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the iron pot on the stove, beginning to smell of what was inside it. "You've been doing this since November?" Agnes asked. "Bought the birds in November." "Yes." "How sick were they?" "Crop impaction on most of them, mite damage on several. One was already losing condition. She didn't make it past the first week." "What did you use for the crop impaction?" "Warm chamomile water to start, gentle massage, small, frequent feedings until the gut started moving right again. Kept them warm. I burned through my good lamp oil faster than I'd planned, but the cold was the main risk." Agnes nodded. One of the women from her county, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who had introduced herself as Clara Voss, leaned forward slightly. "And the feed method. Marjorie said you have a specific method." "I do." Mabel opened the pot to check and basted the birds and closed it again. It started as recovery protocol and became something else. The bone broth mashed, and that was the first thing I added that I didn't have a clear precedent for. I did it because it felt right, and it seemed to work. The herb additions came from my mother's notes and my own observations. The grub supplementation was practical. It cost nothing, and the protein was good for the recovery stage. The corn-heavy finish for meat birds was something I worked out by reasoning backward from what I wanted the meat to be. "Reason backward," Clara said. "If I want a specific quality in the meat, I need to understand what produces that quality. So I thought about what the meat should taste like, and then I thought about what feed would build that. It's not complicated in principle. It's complicated in practice because you have to actually watch the birds and adjust constantly." Silence in the kitchen, except for the stove. Marjorie said, "It smells remarkable," and Mabel could hear the slight unwillingness in her voice, as if the compliment had escaped before she could stop it. At 3 o'clock, Mabel took the birds off the heat and rested them and then carved them at the table, which she'd set with the household's best plates and the good linen cloth she'd pressed that morning. She served each woman the same portion, a piece of white meat and a piece of dark, no elaborate presentation, just the bird and the pan drippings and the herbs from the cavity laid to the side. She didn't serve herself. She stood near the stove and watched. Agnes tasted the white meat first. She was methodical about it. She didn't rush, and she didn't perform any reaction. She simply tasted and considered. Then the dark meat. Then she put her fork down and sat for a moment. The room was quiet. "Miss Hart?" Agnes said. "Yes, ma'am." "Where did you develop the finishing feed ratio? The corn-to-grain proportion?" "My own calculation," Mabel said, "based on what I observed in the bird's condition over several weeks." "And the salt cure is overnight?" 8 hours. "Not longer. The texture changes if it goes past 10. Agnes nodded slowly. "I've tasted competition birds from 3 counties," she said. "I've judged 37 individual birds in formal competitions in 6 years. She paused. "This meat is in the top 5 things I've tasted in that time." The silence after that was a different kind of silence. Clara Voss said quietly, "Agnes doesn't say things she doesn't mean." "I know she doesn't," Mabel said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's why I asked her." Marjorie Pruitt was looking at her plate with an expression that Mabel couldn't entirely read, and didn't try to. She had enough to think about already. Agnes picked up her fork again. I have 2 questions, she said. The first is whether you've considered selling the method itself. Not just the birds, but the protocol. The documentation. I've thought about it, Mabel said. I've been keeping notes since November. Good. Agnes tried the dark meat again. The second question is whether you're planning to expand the flock. Mabel looked at her. I'd like to. I need capital for that. What would you need? She'd thought about this too. She had in fact spent part of a February night running numbers by lamplight and then folding the paper away because it seemed too bold to take seriously. She took it seriously now. 20 birds, she said. Healthy, this time. I could work with sick ones again, but healthy would be faster. Quality Rhode Island Reds or Plymouth Rocks. Better feed costs for the first 2 months while the protocol establishes. And something to properly seal the coop against winter. I managed this year with patchwork, but I lost efficiency to the cold that I'd rather not lose again. Agnes listened. Then she said, I know 2 women in Caldwell County who have been looking for a reason to invest in local poultry operations. They have capital. They are serious people. She looked at Mabel directly. I would be willing to write a letter of introduction based on what I've tasted today and what you've told me about your methods. That letter would carry weight. Mabel stood at the stove in her small kitchen with 5 women at her table and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that was entirely different from all the previous times it had shifted. Before, the ground shifting had meant loss. The turnips freezing, the money running out, the words she heard through the trading post wall. This was the ground shifting the other way. She didn't know what to do with that. She was 23 years old and she had spent most of those years managing loss, and managing something else entirely was going to require a different set of muscles. I would be grateful for the letter, she said. Agnes nodded. I'll have it to you before I leave Friday morning. She picked up her fork again. Now, tell me more about the chamomile protocol. I want to understand the quantities. Mabel pulled out a chair and sat down and told her everything she knew. Agnes Whitmore's letter arrived on a Friday morning, slipped under the Hart farmhouse door before sunrise, folded twice and sealed with plain wax. Mabel found it when she came in from the early feeding, still cold from the April air, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it on the floor for a moment before she picked it up. She read it at the table with her coffee going cold beside her. It was 3 paragraphs. Agnes was not a woman who used more words than a thing required. The first paragraph described the tasting in plain, specific language. The date, the preparation method, the quality of the meat as Agnes assessed it, in terms that were technical enough to be credible and clear enough that a person without agricultural expertise could understand what they meant. The second paragraph described Mabel's recovery protocol and the feed method in the same plain language, and stated that in Agnes Whitmore's considered opinion, the methods represented a genuine and reproducible advancement over common frontier poultry practice. The third paragraph was 4 sentences addressed to a woman named Helen Garrett and her business partner Sophia Crane, both of Caldwell, both known to Agnes personally, both described as women with capital and the sense to use it. The letter recommended Mabel Hart as a person worth investing in. Mabel read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands and sat there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular. Outside, Anchor was crowing his morning complaint at the sky. The stove ticked as it heated. Somewhere in the house, her father's floorboards announced him getting up. He came into the kitchen in his work clothes, moving with the careful, deliberate quality of a man whose body requires negotiation in the morning. He saw her at the table. He saw what she was holding. Letter came, he said. Agnes left it before she went. He poured his coffee and sat across from her and waited. She slid the letter across the table. He read it slowly. He had always been a slow reader, not because he was poor at it, but because he took the activity seriously and didn't rush things he was taking seriously. When he finished, he set it down and picked up his coffee and looked at the window. Helen Garrett, he said. I've heard that name. Agnes says she has capital. Agnes Whitmore says you're worth investing in. That's what the letter says. Earl turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside, one of the hens had started her egg-laying announcement. The particular vocal pattern that Mabel had learned meant a bird had done what it came to do and wanted acknowledgement for it. Earl looked in the direction of the sound. Your mother, he said, would have framed this letter. I'm going to write to Helen Garrett this week, Mabel said. I need to do it properly. I've never written a business letter before and I don't want to do it wrong. What are you going to ask for? Enough for 20 healthy birds, quality stock. Better feed for the first establishment period. New boards for the co-op's east and south walls. The patch I put in won't hold another winter. She paused. And I want to ask about the possibility of a larger arrangement, not just this flock. I've been thinking about whether the recovery protocol could be applied more broadly, taking in birds from other farms that are struggling and turning them around. If the method works as consistently as I think it does, there's a business in that. Earl looked at her. That's a big thing to put in a first letter. I know. I'm going to write it out and let you read it before I send it. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled without requiring further discussion. Then he picked up the letter and read it one more time and set it down carefully in the middle of the table as though it had a specific place that belonged to it. Word moved through Briar Ridge the way it always moved, without anyone being able to name who had said what first, but with everyone knowing everything within 48 hours. By Sunday, the substance of Agnes Whitmore's tasting had made its circuit. What she'd said, how she'd said it, the fact of the letter. Marjorie Pruitt was the primary source, Mabel assumed, though Clara Voss and the other women from Caldwell had likely talked before they left as well. By Monday, it had been discussed at the trading post. By Tuesday, 3 people had knocked on the Hart farmhouse gate. The first was Dorothea Marsh, who came with her sister Ruth, and a directness that Mabel had begun to appreciate. "We want to buy a bird," Dorothea said, standing at the gate. "A whole bird for cooking." "I'm not selling meat yet," Mabel said. "The flock isn't large enough. I'm still building egg production." "When will you have meat birds?" "I don't know exactly. A few months, if things go the way I'm planning." Dorothea looked at her steadily. "We'll wait," she said. "Put our name on a list if you have one." Mabel didn't have a list. She got a piece of paper that afternoon and started one. The second visitor was less welcome. Gus Cutter came on Monday with his hat in his hands, which was not a posture she associated with him, and stood at the gate with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now less confident about it than he was at home. "Heard Agnes Whitmore was impressed," he said. "You heard right," Mabel said. Gus turned his hat brim through his fingers. "Those were my birds, originally. You sold them to me for 5 cents. I know I did." He cleared his throat. "I was wondering if maybe there was some arrangement we could come to, given that the birds came from my stock." Mabel looked at him for a moment. She took a breath. She thought about what she wanted to say and what it would cost her to say it and what it would cost her not to. "Gus," she said, "you put those birds in a cold, drafty coop with inadequate feed and no attention to their condition. They got sick because of how they were kept. You sold them for 5 cents because you'd written them off. I bought them, and I spent the winter and most of my family's remaining resources bringing them back and developing the method that produced what Agnes tasted." She kept her voice even. "There's no arrangement. What I built is mine." Gus stood there. He was not, she thought, a genuinely malicious person. He was a man who had a loose relationship with what belonged to whom when it became inconvenient. That was a different thing, but it was also not something she was willing to accommodate. "No hard feelings," he said finally, which was the thing men said when they meant the opposite. "None," she said, which was not entirely true but was close enough. He left. She went back to the coop. The third visitor was the one she hadn't anticipated. He came Tuesday afternoon after the market, and she was in the yard splitting a round of firewood, awkward work, because her arms were strong, but her balance on the uneven ground required constant adjustment. When she heard the gate and looked up and saw Robert Stills, she set the hatchet down. She didn't do anything with her face because she'd had months of practice keeping her face doing what she wanted it to do. She waited. He walked across the yard with the particular walk of a man who is pretending to be more casual than he is. He stopped at a reasonable distance, which she noticed and credited him for. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Stills." He looked at the coop, then at her. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I heard about the tasting," he said. "Agnes Whitmore's letter." "It's been the talk of the week," she said. "I wanted to—" He stopped. He put his hands in his pockets and took them out again. "I said something at the trading post a while back, in January." She waited. "I don't know if you heard it," he said. "I heard it." He looked at the ground. He was 31 now, she thought, and his face when it was doing something honest was different from his face when it was doing the performance of casual confidence. "It was a stupid thing to say," he said. "It was a cruel thing to say. I don't have a better explanation than that I said it without thinking, and I knew it was wrong the moment it was out of my mouth." Mabel picked up the hatchet and set the next round on the block. "Did it change what I was doing?" she said. "No," he said. "Did it slow me down?" A pause. "No." "Then it's done," she said. She split the round. The pieces fell to either side. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt because it did, but I don't have the energy to carry it, so I'm not going to." Robert Stills stood there for a moment. He looked like he'd prepared for more resistance and wasn't entirely sure what to do with less of it. He stopped. "You're more generous than I deserve." "I'm practical," she said. "It's not the same thing." She picked up the pieces and stacked them. He stayed where he was for a moment, then said, "My brother and I have been talking about our flock. The production has been down this year. I don't know if... I wondered if you'd be willing to take a look at our setup. Tell us what you think." She looked at him. "For pay," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for charity." She thought about it, not because she was uncertain about the answer, but because she wanted to think about it clearly before she gave it. "I'm busy this month," she said. Maybe. I'll think about it." He nodded. "Fair enough." He took a few steps toward the gate, then stopped. "Those birds you brought back. From nothing, essentially. It's not nothing, what you did." "No," she said. "It isn't." He left. She split the rest of the firewood and carried it to the porch in 2 loads and went inside and stood at the kitchen window for a moment looking at the coop. The sound from inside was ordinary. The mid-afternoon sounds of birds going about bird business, unhurried and uncomplicated. Anchor making his occasional authority announcements. Stubbs' murmur. She thought about what Robert Stills had looked like standing in her yard with his hands uncertain and his face doing something honest. She thought about January and the creek and the 5 minutes she'd stood there letting herself feel the full weight of what she'd heard. She thought, "I'm still here and he's at my gate asking for help." That wasn't satisfaction exactly. It was more complicated than satisfaction. It was the feeling of a scale that had tipped, slowly, without fanfare, but definitively. The letter to Helen Garrett took 4 drafts. The first was too apologetic, full of qualifications and softening language that she recognized as the voice she used when she was trying not to take up too much space. She threw it out. The second was too technical. She'd overcorrected and filled it with protocol details that belonged in a separate document, not in an introduction. The third was better but too long. The fourth was right, or close enough to right that her father read it and said, "Send this one," which was the clearest endorsement she was going to get from him. She sent it on a Wednesday in the second week of April, walked it to the Holloway Trading Post herself, and paid the postal fee from the egg money, and then spent the next 2 weeks trying not to think about it, which went about as well as it usually does. What she did instead of thinking about it was work. She had the flock to manage, which was always enough to fill the hours if she let it. She began drafting the documentation Agnes had suggested, a formal written version of the recovery protocol, detailed enough to be followed by someone who hadn't developed it. She'd never written anything like it before. She found that writing about what she knew was different from talking about it. Talking. She could adjust in real time based on who she was talking to, but writing required her to decide exactly what she meant and commit to it, which was harder and produced something cleaner. She wrote the protocol longhand on the back of flour sacking, which was what she had. She would copy it properly when she had proper paper. Stubbs started laying every day in April instead of every other day, which Mabel marked in her notes with a small additional notation that translated roughly to about time. The flock's egg production was now reliable enough that she was selling 4 dozen per week at market, and had a small waiting list for whole birds that she was managing with the discipline of someone who knew that disappointing people who were paying attention was worse than never having their attention in the first place. She didn't overpromise. She didn't sell birds she wasn't ready to sell. She kept the list and updated it honestly. Frances Holloway appeared at the gate again. Mabel saw her coming and felt the familiar weariness, but the weariness was different now. Less personal, more like the fatigue of a task that had to be performed regardless. Frances was carrying a covered dish. She held it out when Mabel opened the gate. "I made too much soup," Frances said. Mabel took the dish. Thank you. Francis's eyes moved to the coop, to the yard, to the new boards on the east wall. You've been busy, she said. Yes. The whole settlement's been talking about Agnes Whitmore. Francis paused. There was something in her face that was not quite an apology, and not one. I might have said things, early on, about the birds, and about the likelihood of it working out. You might have, Mabel agreed. Francis pressed her lips together. I was wrong about it. Yes, Mabel said. You were. Francis blinked. She had possibly expected more forgiveness or more recrimination and had received neither. Well, she said. The soup is appreciated, Mabel said. I mean that. Francis left with the particular posture of someone who had tried to do the right thing and found it less comfortable than expected. Mabel took the soup inside and served some to her father and ate a bowl herself and didn't think about Francis Holloway for the rest of the day, which was itself a kind of progress. Helen Garrett's reply came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Mabel had sent her letter. It was longer than Agnes's letter and written in the hand of someone who conducted business regularly and knew what business correspondence was supposed to accomplish. Helen Garrett confirmed that she had read Agnes Whitmore's letter before Mabel's arrived, and that Agnes had additionally spoken to her by messenger. She had discussed the matter with her partner Sophia Crane. They were interested. She had questions about the scale of the current operation, about the documentation Mabel mentioned, about the specific capital requirements and the proposed terms. The letter ended with an invitation. If Mabel was willing to travel to Caldwell in May, Helen Garrett would like to meet in person. Mabel read this at the table, stood up, walked to the window, came back to the table, and read it again. Earl came in from the barn to find her standing in the kitchen with the letter in her hand and an expression he apparently couldn't read because he said, "Good news or bad?" "I have to go to Caldwell," she said. He took the letter from her and read it. "May," he said. 3 weeks. "Can you manage the flock for a day or two?" He meant could she arrange coverage? She was already thinking about it. Dorothea Marsh's sister Ruth had expressed genuine interest in the birds, had asked more questions than anyone in Briar Ridge other than the women from Caldwell. She might do it. She could be shown the morning and evening routines. It wasn't ideal, but it was possible. "I think so," she said. "You'll need to get there and back," he said. "That's money." "I know." He looked at the window. He looked at the letter. He said, "I have $14 saved from the turnip sales last year. I was keeping it for seed money, but the seeds can wait a season." "Papa, you going to Caldwell to meet with women who have capital is worth more than this spring seed money," he said. "That's not sentiment. That's arithmetic." She looked at him. He was 61 years old, and his back was worse every year, and his hands weren't as steady as they'd been, and he had watched his family spend 2 decades narrowing down. His wife, his son leaving, the farm producing less. He had not complained about any of it in a way that expected a response. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." He handed the letter back. "Write to her today. Tell her May is fine. Don't keep people like that waiting." She wrote the reply that afternoon. The week before Caldwell, Mabel trained Ruth Marsh. It was not an elegant process. Ruth was willing and reasonably careful, but she had no experience with chickens specifically, and Mabel had spent 5 months developing an intuition for the flock that she couldn't simply transfer in 4 hours of instruction. She tried anyway. She walked Ruth through the morning routine, the feeding ratios, the water temperature for the mash, how to tell the difference between a bird that was off its feed because of normal variation and a bird that was off its feed because something was wrong. She showed her where the notes were kept and how to read them. "If Quarter doesn't eat by the second feeding," Mabel said, "add a little warm bone broth to the mash. She's sensitive. She always has been." Ruth was writing things down, which Mabel appreciated. "What about Anchor? What about him?" "He doesn't like me," Ruth said. "He stared at me for 5 minutes without moving." "He does that. Don't let him position himself between you and the feed bucket. He'll try to. Just move around him." "He's a rooster." "He's the rooster," Mabel said. "He knows it." Ruth looked at the coop with the expression of someone revising their expectations. "How long will you be gone?" 2 days, maybe 3 if the meeting runs long. "And if something goes wrong?" Send for my father, Mabel said. He knows the birds? He won't say he does, but he does. She was right about that. Over the winter, without discussing it, Earl had become part of the operation in his quiet way. He checked the coop before bed most nights. He'd started keeping an eye on the feed supply without being asked. Once, when Mabel was sick for 2 days in February with a chest cold that made her useless, she'd come back out to find the birds fed and watered and the coop floor fresher than she'd left it. Earl had said nothing about it. She had said nothing about it. It was one of the arrangements between them that functioned best without words. The morning she left for Caldwell, she was up at 3. She did the full morning routine herself, so Ruth would only need to manage the evening and the following mornings. She stood in the coop for a few minutes after the feeding, longer than she needed to, and she told herself she was checking the condition of the birds, which was true, and she was also just standing there with them, which was also true. Stubb was laying. Mabel could tell from the posture, the settled, concentrated quality of a bird doing what it was built to do. She waited until the egg came, which took 20 minutes, and she held it in her palm on the way out, still warm. She brought it inside and left it in a bowl on the kitchen table with a note that said, "For Papa's breakfast." Then she picked up her bag and walked to meet the early wagon south. Caldwell was larger than Briar Ridge by several orders of magnitude, which Mabel had known intellectually and found disorienting in practice. The streets were actual streets, not packed dirt paths with ruts. There were buildings she'd call buildings rather than structures. The wagon dropped her at the central square, and she stood there for a moment with her bag and her documentation and her good dress, and the particular feeling of a person from a small place arriving at a larger one, not intimidated exactly, but aware of scale in a way she hadn't needed to be before. Helen Garrett's office was above a dry goods establishment on the main commercial street. She found it by asking twice, which was 2 more times than she'd have preferred, but she found it. Helen Garrett was 50, with close-cut gray hair and the handshake of someone who had been shaking hands on equal terms for 30 years and expected nothing less in return. Her partner, Sophia Crane, was a decade younger, quieter, with eyes that moved over details quickly and missed very little. They had tea waiting and a table cleared for working, which Mabel took as a good sign. "Agnes speaks well of you," Helen said, which was her version of an opening. "Agnes was honest with me," Mabel said. "That's the most useful thing anyone's been in some time." Helen nodded as though this were the right answer. "Let's see what you've brought." Mabel put the documentation on the table. The protocol, written out in her careful hand. The notes from the flour sack paper, which she'd transcribed properly on real paper before she left. 5 months of observations, feeding records, recovery timelines, the small adjustments, and their outcomes. She'd also brought the list. 12 families in Briar Ridge who had asked to buy birds with dates and quantities. Sophia Crane picked up the documentation and began reading. She read the way Agnes tasted, methodically, without performing any reaction, simply processing. Helen looked at the list. 12 buyers already. "And I'm not selling yet," Mabel said. "I've been turning people away because my flock isn't large enough to meet demand and maintain the laying operation at the same time." "What do you need to do both?" Mabel told her the numbers. She'd worked them carefully, not optimistically, not cautiously, but as accurately as she could estimate based on 5 months of actual data. Helen listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of respect. "And the recovery operation," Sophia said, without looking up from the documentation. "Taking in struggling birds from other farms. You mentioned this in your letter." "It's what I know best," Mabel said. "I built the method from scratch on birds that should have died. I know how to do it. There are farms in this territory losing birds every winter to preventable conditions. If they knew the protocol, or if I could take in the worst cases and turn them around, that's a service worth paying for." Sophia set the documentation down and looked at Helen. Something passed between them that didn't require words. "Your documentation is better than most men's would be," Sophia said, "in my experience." "I had reasons to be precise," Mabel said. Helen leaned back in her chair. She had the look of a woman arriving at a decision that she'd mostly already made, but was confirming through the last stage of a process. "We're going to want to come to Briar Ridge," she said. "See the operation ourselves before we commit. Is that agreeable?" "Completely," Mabel said. "June," Helen said. "We'll come in June." Mabel nodded. She kept her face steady. She was very good at keeping her face steady. "One more thing," Helen said. She folded her hands on the table. "Agnes mentioned that the town had certain reactions to your work early on." "That's a polite way to put it," Mabel said. "I'm asking because it matters to us, as investors, whether you have the disposition to continue building something under difficult conditions." Helen looked at her directly. "Some people find that once circumstances improve, they run out of fuel. The difficulty was what was driving them." Mabel looked back at her. She thought about what drove her. She thought about her mother's journal and the flour sack paper covered in her own notes and the warm egg in her palm at 3 a.m. before she left. She thought about Stubbs' egg on the kitchen table for her father's breakfast. "The work is what's driving me," she said. "The circumstances are just the weather." Helen Garrett smiled. It was small and it was real. "June," she said again. "We'll be in touch before then." Mabel walked back to the wagon stop through Caldwell's actual streets and stood waiting with her bag and her empty documentation folder, and felt the size of what might be coming. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the moment before a long climb when you look up and see the actual distance remaining and think, all right, this is the real work now. She'd been waiting for the real work her whole life. The wagon came. She got on it and started home. The wagon from Caldwell got her home by late afternoon, and the first thing she did when she came through the gate was go to the coop. Not the house. Not to tell her father about the meeting or put down her bag or change out of the good dress that she'd been wearing for 2 days and was ready to be out of. The coop first, because that was the order of things, and because she needed to see them before she could think clearly about anything else. Ruth Marsh had done well. The birds were settled, the water was fresh, the straw had been turned. Quarter had eaten. Mabel could tell from the look of her the slight fullness in the crop. Stubb was on her usual roosting bar. Anchor observed Mabel's return from his elevated position with the expression of a rooster who will not admit he was uncertain about anything in her absence, but whose relief is visible anyway. "Everything's where I left it," she told him. He rearranged his feathers with great dignity. She went to the house. Her father was at the table with a cup of cold coffee and a book he'd been reading the same chapter of for 3 weeks, which was how he read when he had things on his mind. He looked up. "How'd it go?" he said. She sat down. She was tired in the deep, specific way of someone who has been performing competence in unfamiliar territory for 2 days without a break. "They want to come in June," she said, "to see the operation. If the visit goes the way I think it will, they'll invest." Earl looked at her. "You think it will?" "Yes," she said. "I do." He nodded. He closed the book, which was its own signal. "Ruth said the birds were good while you were gone. Quarter ate on her own both days." "I saw." Anchor terrorized her a little on the second morning. "She'll learn," Mabel said. Earl got up and poured his cold coffee out and made fresh, and he made a cup for her too without asking, which was something he'd started doing sometime in February without comment. He put it in front of her and sat back down. "Your mother," he said, and then stopped. Mabel waited. "Your mother would have wanted to hear every word of that meeting," he said. "She would have asked you 20 questions and remembered all the answers and told the story better than you did." Mabel wrapped her hands around the cup. "She would have been there herself," she said. "She wouldn't have needed me to go." Earl was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "But you went, and you're the one coming home with a meeting in June." It was the closest thing to "I'm proud of you" that Earl Hart was able to produce, and Mabel understood that and received it as such. June came with heat and the particular optimism that early summer has before the prairie makes clear what it intends to do with the season. Helen Garrett and Sophia Crane arrived on a Wednesday in a hired wagon, dressed practically, carrying a leather case between them that held, Mabel would learn, a considerable amount of organized paperwork. They were not women who showed up to things unprepared. Mabel showed them everything. She walked them through the coop, the repaired walls, the roosting arrangement, the ventilation she'd worked out over winter. She showed them the feeding station and explained the mash ratios and where each component came from and what it cost and why it was worth the cost. She showed them the recovery enclosure where she still kept Quarter and one other bird who was permanently the slowest of the flock and needed managing accordingly. She showed them the notes, The full documentation she'd developed, organized now into a proper bound booklet that she'd spent 3 evenings assembling. Sophia Crane went through the booklet the way she'd gone through the documents in Caldwell, carefully, without rush. Helen walked the yard, looking at the ground, the fence line, the outbuildings, the distance to the creek. Water access in winter, Helen said. The creek doesn't freeze solid until January, and even then, only the edges, Mabel said. I cut through to running water. It adds time to the morning routine, but it's reliable. If you expanded, say 5 times your current flock size, where would you put them? Mabel showed her the field to the east of the current coop, which she'd already been thinking about. She'd paced it out in May, counted the posts she'd need for the expansion fencing, calculated the additional feed costs against the projected egg and meat revenue. She had numbers. She gave Helen the numbers. Helen looked at the field. She looked at Mabel. You've already planned this, she said. I've been planning it since February, Mabel said. I was just waiting to know whether I'd be planning it alone. Helen almost smiled. You wouldn't have been, either way, she said. You'd have found a different path. Probably, Mabel said. But a slower one. They spent the afternoon at the kitchen table. Earl made himself scarce, which was his way. He understood when his presence was not the point, and he was good at disappearing into the barn without making it seem like that was what he was doing. Mabel sat across from Helen and Sophia, and they went through the proposal line by line, and it was not an easy conversation. Sophia had sharp questions about the recovery operation, the liability of it, the practical question of what happened when she took in a bird that didn't recover, and a farmer felt he was owed for the loss. Helen wanted to understand the documentation rights, who owned the protocol. What prevented another farmer from simply reading Mabel's booklet and replicating the method without compensating her for it? These were not comfortable questions. They were the right questions. Mabel answered them as honestly as she could and said, I don't know yet, when she didn't know yet, which happened twice, and she wrote down the things she needed to think about and didn't pretend otherwise. At the end of the afternoon, Helen put a number on the table. It was larger than what Mabel had asked for in her letter. Not enormously, not the kind of number that changes the nature of a thing entirely, but meaningfully more, with the difference allocated specifically to the eastern field expansion and a proper winterized coop structure instead of the patched board version she'd been managing with. Our terms, Sophia said, sliding a document across, are 20% of the operation's net revenue for 3 years, after which we renegotiate or you buy us out at the assessed value of our contribution. The protocol documentation stays yours. We have no claim to it beyond what it produces in this specific operation. Mabel read the document. She read it slowly because she was her father's daughter and didn't rush things she was taking seriously. Some of the language was unfamiliar, and she said so, and Sophia explained it without condescension, which Mabel noted and was grateful for. She asked for one change, a clause that specified her right to continue developing and documenting the protocol independently, including the right to share it with other farmers at her discretion. This had not been in the original terms. Helen and Sophia looked at each other. That reduces its exclusivity, Sophia said. I know, Mabel said. I'm not interested in keeping the method locked away. People are losing birds to conditions I know how to treat. I want the ability to help them, and I don't want it to be contingent on what's profitable for the operation. It was a bold thing to ask for in a first investor agreement. She knew that. She said it anyway because it was true and because she had learned over the winter that not saying the true thing in order to make a transaction easier was a trade that cost more than it saved. Another look between Helen and Sophia. Then Helen said, "We'll add the clause." They signed it that evening. Summer in Briar Ridge moved differently after that. Not because the town changed overnight. It didn't. People were still people, and small settlements have a way of incorporating new information slowly, folding it into the existing story of a place without fully acknowledging what has shifted. But things moved. The first 20 birds arrived in July. Healthy Rhode Island Reds from a reputable stock operation 2 counties over, selected by Mabel herself on a day trip that she planned and executed with the specific focus of someone who has learned that what you start with matters as much as what you do with it. She spent 4 hours at the stock farm walking among the birds, watching how they moved, checking feather quality and eye clarity, and the way they responded to being handled. She brought home exactly the bird she wanted and paid exactly what she'd budgeted. The eastern field coop went up in August, Built by a carpenter from Caldwell, who came recommended by Sophia Crane, and who did good solid work without overcharging for it, though Mabel watched every stage of the construction and asked questions at each step, and caught two things she had opinions about before they became permanent, which the carpenter took in the spirit it was intended. She also added one structural feature he hadn't planned: a wider ventilation opening along the south wall, positioned and sized based on what she'd learned about airflow over 2 winters in the original coop. He looked at her calculation and said, "That's better," and adjusted the plans. With 38 birds, 9 from the original flock and 29 from the new stock, the operation became something that required managing as an operation and not just as a farm practice. She made a schedule. She delegated more deliberately. Ruth Marsh became a regular presence 2 mornings per week, and Mabel was honest enough to notice that Ruth had gotten genuinely good with the birds, patient and observant in a way that suggested she had her own intuition for them that had been waiting for the chance to develop. "Quarter likes you better than she likes me now," Mabel told her one morning in September. "Quarter likes anyone who doesn't rush her," Ruth said. She was filling the water basin with the particular gentle efficiency she'd developed. "She's not complicated. She just needs things to be calm." "I know," Mabel said. "I'm sometimes not calm enough for her." Ruth looked at her sideways. "You're always calm." "I'm quiet," Mabel said. "It's not the same thing." Ruth thought about this and nodded, which was the right response. By October, the waiting list had grown to 31 names. Mabel was selling 4 dozen eggs a week at market and a steady rotation of meat birds. She'd worked out a production cycle that kept the laying flock intact while generating surplus birds for sale, which had required some of the more complicated calculations she'd done, balancing the development timeline of individual birds against the revenue needs of the operation. She got it right enough. Not perfectly. She'd oversold in August and had to go back to 2 families on the list and explain the delay, which was an uncomfortable pair of conversations she'd rather not have had. But she'd had them, and she'd been direct about the reason, and both families stayed on the list. Dorothea Marsh came to the market on the 2nd Saturday of October and bought a whole bird. Finally, the first on the list, her name having been there since February, and came back the following Saturday. "My husband wants to know if you do geese," she said. "I don't," Mabel said. "Not yet." Dorothea smiled at the "not yet" and bought her eggs and left. The recovery operation started quietly, without announcement, which was how Mabel had decided to begin it. She wasn't ready to advertise something she hadn't fully proven in the expanded context, and she was wary of the gap between what she could do carefully with one farmer's struggling birds and what she might promise if she let the reputation run ahead of the reality. The first case came to her through Ruth, whose neighbor the Finch family saw. The young woman who'd bought eggs at the first market back in February had a small flock that had gone wrong in September. Respiratory issues, poor feathering, declining egg production. The husband had decided they were done for. His wife had heard about Mabel. Mabel went out to the Finch farm on a Wednesday with her documentation and looked at the birds and talked to Clara Finch for 40 minutes about the conditions the birds were kept in, what they'd been fed, what had changed in the months before the decline. She took in 6 birds on a trial basis and left Clara with a modified version of the feeding protocol adapted to what she knew about their specific situation. She told herself she would only take in what she could manage without compromising the main flock. 6 birds was within that limit. 4 of the 6 recovered enough to return to the Finch farm in November with an improvement in condition that Clara said made her husband go quiet and stand at the coop for 5 minutes without speaking. One had an underlying condition that Mabel couldn't reverse but could make more comfortable. One didn't make it, which Mabel had disclosed as a possibility from the beginning and which she documented honestly in her records. She charged the Finch family a modest fee and spent more time than the fee covered, and she decided that was the right ratio for a first case. The documentation she'd produced from the Finch case was, if anything, more detailed than what she'd produced from her own experience, because teaching something always reveals the parts of it you don't fully understand yet. She revised 2 sections of the protocol booklet based on what she'd learned. By November, a full year since she'd carried a crate of dying chickens up the hill from Cutter's yard on a muddy road while half the settlement laughed, she had 3 recovery cases running simultaneously, a waiting list that represented real regional demand, an operation that was generating real revenue, and a name that had traveled from Briar Ridge in ways she was still learning about. Agnes Whitmore had written twice more since April. Both letters were practical, She'd heard of a specific struggling operation 3 counties west and thought Mabel should know about it. She had a contact interested in a bulk egg arrangement. She had a question about the chamomile protocol that she'd been testing on her own birds. The correspondence had the quality of two professionals thinking together, which was not something Mabel had had before and was not something she took lightly. She wrote back with the same practical seriousness and enjoyed it more than she expected to. On a Saturday in November that was cold, the way November in Briar Ridge is always cold, dry and certain, and without the drama of early season frost, Mabel went to the market. This was not different from any other Saturday in the past 8 months. She loaded her eggs, she pulled her handcart down the main road, she set up her spot. But the spot was different now. Not at the edge of the square where the smaller vendors went, but 3 places in from the center, which was where she'd moved in August when the volume of her sales made the edge impractical. 3 places in from the center, with a proper painted sign that Ruth's brother had made for her in trade for 2 months of eggs. Hart Farm. Eggs and Poultry. Rhode Island Reds. She sold out of eggs by 10 o'clock. After that, she had 2 conversations about the waiting list. One conversation with a farmer from a settlement 15 miles east who had heard about the recovery work and wanted to discuss his flock, and one conversation with a man from the county agricultural office who had been in Briar Ridge for an unrelated meeting and had heard, he explained, that there was a woman at the market who had developed a documented poultry recovery protocol, and he was interested in learning more. His name was Thomas Wilder, and he was polite and serious and took careful notes and asked questions that told her he actually understood what she was describing. She gave him a copy of the protocol booklet. She only had 2 copies with her. She'd started having them properly bound at the print shop in Caldwell, and she gave one to him without hesitating. "This is your documented system," he said, looking at the cover. "You're giving me a copy. I want it read," she said. "That's what it's for." He looked at her for a moment with the specific look of someone recalibrating their expectations of a situation. "I'd like to discuss this further. There are cooperative extension programs in this territory that might be interested in sponsoring the documentation for wider distribution." "Write to me," she said. "I'm at the farm north of the ridge. Anyone in Briar Ridge can direct you." He wrote to her 3 weeks later. Gus Cutter came to the market that November Saturday. He'd been coming for months, like everyone else, buying eggs. She'd noticed and hadn't said anything. He was not a complicated man, and she'd made peace with the specific, uncomplicated way he had been wrong about her. He bought his 6 eggs the way he always did, and then, instead of leaving, stood at her stall for a moment. "I want you to know," he said, "that I think about those 12 cents. "Don't trouble yourself about it," she said. "I'm not troubling myself, I just—" He turned the egg packet in his hands. "I made a mistake about you, is what I'm saying." "You made a business decision based on what you could see," she said. "You didn't see the whole picture." "I didn't look hard enough." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." He nodded, accepting that, and left with his eggs. She watched him go and thought that there was something useful in that exchange, something she'd been turning over for months without quite finding the center of it. It wasn't about Gus specifically. Gus was just a man who'd done a thoughtless thing and felt bad about it later. It was about what he'd looked at and what he'd missed and why. He had looked at 12 cents and dying birds and a fat young woman, and he had seen waste, an ending, something already finished. He hadn't seen the labor that was present in her, the months of observation she'd already done without being credited for it, the discipline she'd built from her mother's example and her own necessity, and the particular stubbornness that comes from having nothing to fall back on. He hadn't seen any of that because he hadn't thought to look for it. She wasn't the kind of person that kind of thing was expected from. That was the thing, not his cruelty. He wasn't particularly cruel, his failure to expect anything. The way a town, a community, a collection of people who had known you your whole life can decide what you are early and then simply stop looking. The danger was in believing them. That was what she had almost done, 100 times, in ways she didn't like to fully examine. The creek in January. The mornings when she got up at 4 to check the lamp and stood in the cold coop wondering what the point of any of it was. The specific grinding exhaustion of continuing to work towards something that nobody around you could see yet. It would have been easier, not simpler, but easier, to accept the town's assessment, to be what they expected, to stop taking up space with ambitions that seemed, from the outside, like delusion. She had not done that, She wanted to understand why she hadn't, because she didn't think it was just stubbornness. And she didn't think it was just love for the work, though it was both of those things. She thought it was her mother. Not a memory of her mother exactly, not the rolling pin, not the humming, but something her mother had built into her through years of small daily example. Her mother had been a woman who paid attention to what was actually there and not what was expected to be there. She'd paid attention to sick animals and what they needed. She'd paid attention to the soil and what it told her. She'd paid attention to Mabel in the particular way that a person feels when someone is actually seeing them rather than the idea of them. Her mother had seen her. And so even after her mother was gone, Mabel had had the memory of being seen, a fixed point she could return to when everything else was saying she was invisible or worse. Not everyone had that. She knew she was lucky for it in a way that had nothing to do with any larger machinery of luck and everything to do with a specific woman and the choices that woman had made every day of Mabel's childhood. She thought, someone else gave me this, and the right thing to do with something that was given to you is to be useful with it. Earl was on the porch when she came home from the market that afternoon. Not unusual. He was on the porch most afternoons now that the operation was running well enough that she didn't need his quiet auxiliary help as often, and she'd noticed that he seemed to have arrived at something like ease with the situation that he hadn't had since before her mother died. He drank his coffee and watched the yard and listened to the birds and let the afternoon do what it wanted. She came through the gate with the empty handcart, and he looked at her in the way that meant he was going to say something. "Man came by while you were gone," he said. "Young man. Said his name was Calloway from over near Heron Creek." "What did he want?" "Said he'd heard about the recovery work. His flock is having trouble. He wants to bring 4 birds over." Earl paused. "I told him to come back Thursday." She looked at him. "You told him Thursday?" "That's when you told me you'd have time to assess new intakes," he said. "Thursday morning, before the market run." She'd told him that in September when she was working out the weekly schedule. She hadn't known he'd been tracking it. "Thursday's right," she said. "I wrote his name down," Earl said. "It's inside." She came up the porch steps and stopped and looked at him. He was looking at the yard, at the eastern field where the new coop stood solid and properly built, and inside which 38 birds were going about their late afternoon business. Anchor's voice drifted across the distance, his evening announcement to nothing in particular. "Papa," she said. Thank you for everything this year." He turned his coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment. "You did the work," he said. "Not alone." He looked at the field, at the coop, at the sign Ruth's brother had made that now hung above the farm gate, Hart Farm, lettered in plain practical black. He'd been the one to put it up, she knew, on an afternoon in August when she was at the stock farm picking birds. She'd come home and there it was, and she'd looked at it for a long moment and hadn't said anything, and neither had he. "Your mother would have had a lot to say about this year," he said. "Good things? Mostly." He almost smiled. "She would have also told you that you work too hard and eat too little and don't sleep enough." "She'd be right about all 3, Mabel said. "You come by it honestly," he said, and that was as close as Earl Hart would ever get to acknowledging that the stubbornness and the discipline and the refusal to accept other people's limits as her own had come from somewhere, from his side and her mother's side, and the particular combination of the two, and that it had been in her all along, waiting for the circumstances that would make it visible. She went inside. She put the money from the market in the tin on the kitchen shelf, which was more full than it had ever been in her memory. She changed out of her market clothes. She made coffee. Then she went to the coop. The November light was going flat and low, the way it does in the late afternoon when the sun is giving up on the day without drama. The field looked different than it had a year ago. Not just because of the new coop, but because of what was inside it and around it, and because of what it meant, which was something she was still finding the right language for. She opened the door and went in, and the birds moved around her the way they always did. Stubb coming to investigate with her particular curiosity, Anchor positioning himself so that she would have to acknowledge him before she could go anywhere, Quarter hanging back the way she always did, but watching with the steady attention she'd had since January, and the 3 days of hand-feeding. Mabel sat on the overturned bucket and let the sounds of the coop come in around her. This place was real. The work that had built it was real. The method she'd developed through 5 months of cold mornings and insufficient sleep and constant adjustment was real, and documented and spreading. Thomas Wilder's letter had said extension program, and she didn't yet know exactly what that meant, but she knew it meant the protocol would travel further than Briar Ridge, further than this county, and be useful to people she would never meet. She thought about 12 cents. The specific weight of 12 cents in the hand, which is almost nothing, not even the weight of a decision, most days, and what it had built, which was not nothing, which was, in fact, a great deal. She thought about what it means to be underestimated. Not what it feels like. She knew what it felt like. She'd been living in the feeling for 23 years, but what it actually means, in practical terms, when the world decides what you are before it knows what you can do. It means you have to decide for yourself. That's the whole of it. You have to look at the dying birds in the crate and see what no one else sees, not because you're special or because some larger force has appointed you, but because you have paid attention and you have learned things and you know what you know, and other people's failure to see it does not make it less true. The hardest part is not the work. The work is hard, but it is finite, and it is yours. The hardest part is the in-between time. The January creek, the 4 o'clock mornings, the voices you hear through walls. When you have to choose, again and again and again, to believe what you know over what you're told. She had chosen it, not always gracefully, not without cost, but she had chosen it each time, and each time it had held. And what was on the other side of all that choosing was this: a coop full of healthy birds, a father who wrote down a farmer's name so she wouldn't miss the appointment, a protocol spreading outward from a flour sack paper into a printed booklet into whatever Thomas Wilder's extension program made it next. And Stubb, who was now settled against Mabel's leg the way she'd been doing since December, warm and uncomplicated, and entirely herself. Outside, the prairie light was going orange and low. She could see it through the ventilation gap she'd asked the carpenter to widen. The specific opening she'd calculated from 2 winters of watching how air moved through the space, which was a small thing, one small correct thing among many, but it was hers. She sat with the birds until the light was mostly gone. Then she got up, checked the lamp, added oil, made sure the door was secure against the night. She went inside. She helped her father with supper. She wrote 3 letters at the kitchen table by lamplight. One to Helen Garrett, one to Agnes Whitmore, one to the Calloway family confirming Thursday. Then she went to bed at a reasonable hour, which her mother would have approved of, and slept without waking once until anchor crowed in the dark, and told the whole prairie that morning was coming whether it was ready or not. She got up, she went to work. That was the whole story, and it was enough.